Hello, everybody. Welcome to the first of many webinars we'll be running this year, governing unstructured data. And I'm a partner with Agile, and this is very much a presentation that's based on experience with our going through the process of discovering, assigning risk, enabling technology, and going through the remediation for application of data classification and data protection. So I hope to have a good amount of you in attendance today, and I'm going to pass it over to Raul for his introduction. Thank you.
Hey, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Raul Underberdy. I'm a director here at Agile. I have worked with Marvin here in creating building out our practice and developing new service offerings such as this one around governing unstructured data. I look forward to not only presenting you what we have to show here, but answering any questions you may have, and have fun. Thank you.
Today we're going to talk about governing unstructured data. This is based on our experience from some implementations, and we have some key points to talk about. Next slide. Okay, so the 10 discussion points we're going to talk about today for unstructured data remediation. The idea of this is we're not talking about only technology. We're talking about people, process, and technology. And sensitive unstructured data as a concept has an inherent risk value. We'll talk about how do we get to understanding what that risk value is, and that a lack of infosec controls increases the likelihood of an impact happening. So inherent risk, just as you have a loading dock and somebody falling off it and hurting themselves is a risk to the business, so you put appropriate railings and signs and notifications and train people on how to do that. Unstructured data has the same sense. Now I want to just take a moment. When we talk about unstructured data here, what we're talking about is we have structured data systems like your accounting systems and customer relationship management systems where data is controlled and people can get into that system through the appropriate roles and responsibilities they have, and they can see that, but the data is viewable and can be changed or added, but it can't be exported in volume unless it comes out. Once it is exported in volume, that's what we're calling unstructured data. And those are large spreadsheets that are needed for the business purposes. And so when we talk about that, it's flat files, spreadsheets in NAS repositories or file drives, and SharePoint and Teams and Box and all of the various places where unstructured data might move around that isn't controlled. Large volumes of sensitive unstructured data represent an opportunity to invest in structured data systems. So the business needs the data. They're using unstructured data for business purposes. If there's large volumes that are being produced on a monthly basis that are sitting there in file drives, it's an opportunity to think about what you would invest in for a structured data system so the data is not an inherent risk, that it remains in the structured data system. The journey of unstructured data governance can't begin without the business owners. We'll talk more about that. The development of a governance model is critical to this process, or to add an existing committee model, and we'll talk about that. And then from the technical aspects, which Raul will be covering, which will be review of what is the technical offering, data classification and protection, how that can reduce the loss event from occurring, right? And then we're talking about to keep it simple for data classification, and then only expand the number of classifications over time, and don't attempt a large-scale data remediation without some sort of ticketing system where you're working workflows, and start with strategy and review the process. So, next slide. So the idea here is sensitive unstructured data has an inherent risk value. So if we start on the far right side and we talk to the idea that your IT organization has ranked IT risk, and that if significant risk is, $18 million or $180 million or whatever that might be, is you've set a threshold for what that represents. Major, moderate, minor. The idea is when we start doing remediation of unstructured data, you may have petabytes of data sitting out there. And the idea is that if you have one file that has 10,000 records in it, that if you think about what the risk of that file being breached and you paying, say, $800 a record, like British Airways did, then the value would be $800 times 10,000. Now, if the data is stored in a file drive that doesn't require approval workflow, doesn't require multi-factor authentication, doesn't have encryption, doesn't have classification, it has a high likelihood of an event happening. So the combination of a lack of security controls and a lot of concentrated data equals significant risk. So when we're going through this process, the concept that we're working with is that you start with your highest risk items and move your way down. And this is the idea of removing risk from your inherent risk from data that is there that's residual of business processes being left over. Next slide, please. So where does this all begin? So large volumes of unstructured data represent an opportunity to invest in a data system. So we start by understanding here on the right-hand side that the goal is to understand the need for the business, for the data in the business, and going to the parts of your business where data is being used because it's accounts payable or accounts receivable, or it's being used to understand the nature of your business and where to invest. So the data comes out and we look at it, we understand what the gaps are, what are the processes, and how do people use unstructured data? Do they just ask for it and a report comes out and it gets sent by email, or is this something that just gets generated and gets dropped into a file? So once we understand that, we understand, is the data being used in a single department? Is it going inter-department, or is it going outside the company? And then once we have that, we have the ability to start developing remediation plans for business units and allow that they'll have an acceptance of risk of what they're doing with this unstructured data and agree on what is the minimum set of controls that you need to have in place in order to have that business process. So this is very same as any other thing I studied as an industrial engineer, and when you're designing a factory, there's lots of risks in factories of machines moving and paint rooms and things like this, but you put your controls in place to prevent the risk from happening. Next slide, please. So you can't begin without the business owners. And the point here is that business is the one who needs the data, who generates the data, who creates value from the data. IT, privacy, security, records, legal, these are all the folks that are involved in helping in the process of making sure the data is secure, how long we retain data, what is the legal ramifications of data, and how do we meet our needs for compliancy, and IT is helping operate the systems around that. But you start with the business owners, you understand how the business uses it, and you start deconflicting the stakeholder requirements, and you get into the process where you say you're going to create and use data. How long will I hold it for? How long before it's deleted? How long do I need to, where am I going to store it and secure it? And then finally, how do I get rid of it? And so these processes need to be thought through in the life cycle of the data and how long it'll be held for. Next slide. So when we look at it from a governance model, we think of the very bottom of this pyramid being the operational department. And we look at for who are the data producers, the 20% that are generating 80% of the sensitive data. We're looking for those people first. We're understanding how they're using it. And then we're going up to the next level and saying that data is needed tactically. We have a lack of a structured data system, so we're outputting it into spreadsheets to do things with it, or we're outputting it into a flat file to break it up to put it into another system, and it's sitting in between systems. And we understand how that's used, and we understand the risk, and we accept that risk with that and understand. We put it then up to the data governance committee, where the data governance committee looks at it and says, how does this mean? What does it mean to privacy? How do we audit and make sure that our controls are in place? How do we make sure that if there's an event that we haven't had breach of this data? And then lastly, we look at it from the leadership and steering committee, where we're saying, okay, there is $1 billion worth of unstructured data risk sitting in this department. Do we accept that we need this for the business purposes? Yes, okay. What are the controls? What do we need to invest? How do we make sure that an event that doesn't happen? And then also we look to the horizon and say, what does this structured data system look like, where I'm not proliferating all this unstructured data, so that when I have the ability, somebody says, I want to be forgotten, that you know where your data is and you have the ability to do that, to have a person forgotten. Next slide. I'm going to pass it over to Raul, and Raul is going to talk a little bit about the technical aspects of how you go about implementing these systems and what technologies are available to help and reduce the likelihood. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Marvin. Appreciate that. So now we move into the technology that helps enable a lot of this people process around unstructured data governance. So we'll start with the Microsoft technology offerings. How we start with discovering classification, moving to applying policies, and then taking governance actions. You'll see here we start with the different solutions, both cloud and on-premise, right? Ranging from these different solutions I talk in more detail here in the next slide. We move into a labeling schema that's defined, and then from that labeling schema we apply these controls based on regulatory requirements such as CCPA, GDPR, and so on. These controls could be something as simple as prevention of data leaving, or as complex of only allowing specific users within the organization to open and edit the document, or maybe just open and read the document. And then we go on to ensuring or understanding whether that data still needs to even exist in the organization, right? Whether we agree to retain this data based on some sort of legal requirements that enable the organization to keep this data, or we go ahead and just delete that data altogether. So as I move into diving deeper into the Microsoft technology set, we have 4 specific areas that we pay attention to as it relates to unstructured data governance, managing that, discovering that sensitive data, or discovering the data that contains sensitive information, and then moving on to remediating that data, whether that means, again, protecting or deleting that data or just retaining it. We'll start with Microsoft 365 data loss prevention. As you can see, the DLP functionality of the solution extends not just from Office 365, but to Windows 10 devices as well as on-premise shares. As the name is said here, it prevents data from leaving the organization, depending on the discovered information types within the sensitive data. You then have Azure Information Protection. This goes a step further in applying what's called a protection template to the document that's associated with the specific label. So to the end user, it's label, UI, it's seamless. What's going on in the background is that it applies these granular controls that applies persistent protection to the document lifecycle, regardless of where it lives. You then have Microsoft Cloud App Security, is Microsoft's CASB solution, and while it is able to be used for a number of things in the way we use it for unstructured data governance, we leverage it to do a scan of cloud repositories, identifying and leveraging those same sensitive information types that are built into from the Security and Compliance Center to discover sensitive data and then take appropriate governance actions, whether that means removing external collaborators, moving that file to a quarantine admin site, or simply applying a label that was created in the AIP product. And then lastly, the overall Security and Compliance Center, where we would move into applying retention labels based on specific data governance requirements that are published by your organization or legal counsel, and then do what you need with that data, whether it's to retain or delete that data or keep for 7 years. Once you've gone through the deployment of these solutions, and in my mind, what I would call this as a baseline implementation, because what you'll come to find out is once you've implemented these solutions and you've created what Microsoft calls sensitive information types, and these information types help you detect. It's the algorithm that helps you detect the sensitive data within these documents. This is still an ongoing effort in the continuation of not only data remediation, but refinement in your detection methods. So to ensure that your discovery of data contains true positives while bringing down your false positive rate, you're going to have to work what we call operations work through understanding when you detect data, and if it's a false positive, take note of that and then start making refinements within your detection methods to ensure that you are detecting true positives and reducing your overall false positives. So moving on to the labeling schema, what's important here is when you first think about rolling out your labeling schema, it's important to understand that keeping it as simple as possible is going to improve not just overall usage, but adoption of the solution, as well as developing a communication campaign that helps get the solution out there, that helps users understand the purpose of these labels and have them adopt them, and then start applying them to these labels, or sorry, to these documents as part of their process. You'll notice here we have a simple schema. It's very basic in terms of public and internal, and then you have your confidential and restricted, and then you have your common use cases where you have confidential that's only internal use, and then confidential or restricted for external use as well, depending on the use case. We do have a second tier that we call it. It's business unit and or business team labels. These labels are created only if the company-wide labels are not enough in terms of protection and collaboration efforts. Sometimes you need to shrink down that audience in terms of who you can collaborate with around specific documentation, such as project documents, mergers and acquisitions, stuff like that. A lot of times this is when these these labels will get spun up outside of your traditional company-wide labels.
Hey, Raul, can you just take a minute here and talk about how you would apply protection associated with the labels, and also on the business unit level, what sort of the administrative aspect with security groups and things like that, and why you would want to add that level of protection?
Yeah, so if we look at the protection of it, what's going on in the background of the labels is there's a protection template that's created within the admin portal, right? In this protection template, you're given a slew of options that allow you to designate a specific security group, or even a domain, or external users even, and then apply specific controls that range from as simple as just reading a document to editing or even removing the label of the document. If we extend into business units and our labels, part of the administrative effort that's involved is, is targeting specific security groups, if you will, right? Email enabled security groups or O365 groups. The challenge with that is being able to manage, right? So the reason we recommend trying to push everyone to a company-wide labels is to reduce that overhead in terms of management in terms of group management as it relates to those labels. Unless you have a mature process around group management and as well as ownership, and in most cases integrated into an ITSM solution, which is a great pivot to my next talking point. So Marvin had mentioned earlier, one of the way we approach this is through a risk-based approach. So if we think about how we would address this at scale, we first off would recommend using an ITSM solution like ServiceNow, HP OpenView, or something else, depending on what you're using. And then start at your highest risk point, which in our presentation, we call it a significant risk. And start on the path to remediating this data and moving you on your way down. So if you take a look at this workflow, this is one of many, but this is a simple workflow that kind of illustrates that, how we, a high-risk file was detected. It's a high-risk disposition, so we're going to go ahead and remediate it. Or if there's a user dispute, depending on if it aligns with low or medium, we allow a user to dispute that and say this is a false positive. If it's a true positive, we'll mark it. We'll have to remediate the file. If the file was remediated by the user, mark it as resolved. The user did not remediate it. The data remediation team, as we call it here, would then go look at the file and then make a determination of whether that was a false positive if the user did not reply to the within the number of days. And then they would, if it is deemed to be a false positive, we would take that information and then update the detection method, whether it's regular expression, trainable classifiers, adding or removing dictionary words or keywords of that nature. And then if it is not a false positive, we go ahead and dispose of the item.
Yeah, I think what's really important in this too is that if you scan a business unit or all of your file repositories and you see that you have, I don't know, say 10,000 or 20,000 files that represent significant risk, and you can easily create a report or a dashboard that would say, here's these 10,000 files, 20,000 files that represent significant risk, and we're in the process of remediating them. So now there's a place for you to go look, and we find a file, we send an email to the owner or to the data steward to do remediation process, and the file gets changed state, it gets either deleted or it has a classification put against it, then you can show that you remediated that risk, and it can give you a progress report on your program for showing risk remediation. And I think that's really why we say don't get started without this. Trying to manage these through emails and workflows is at the volume of an enterprise level is just not a sustainable effort. Thanks, Raul.
Thanks, Marvin. So thinking about the ITSM solution to help with the scalability of remediating high-risk data, one of the things we recommend is starting with a strategy, right? Where we have a top-down, bottom-up strategy where it's important to understand, first off, you have an ITSM solution in place. Discovery of data is really important. Understanding what type of data is out there in your environment today, understanding whether that data is being detected appropriately before you start applying governance actions is going to be extremely important, because one of the things that's important when implementing and rolling out this solution is you don't want it to cause business disruption, right? If it causes business disruption, if it becomes a blocker for end users, they'll stop using the solution, and we don't want that. We want to make sure that this solution does what it's intended to do, which is addressing high-risk data. One of the biggest things we can offer here is making sure that you have a clear communication campaign that's being pushed out there and educating the users on the solution, the purpose of the solution, how to apply the solution, taking through some training, user-based training on how to use the solution so that you get a high adoption rate, and you don't have users, you don't have users trying to circumvent or go around the solution, and they take to it really easily, and it becomes a positive user experience overall. So
yeah, and I think just go back there for 1 second. I just wanted to talk through this a little bit. these are big programs for the cost of your technology, for the cost of implementing operational models that will run and do this. And if we look at sort of the hard part of this is refining your data models for your false positives and negatives through the techniques that are available within the tools to be able to positively identify the data types for your organization. There are going to be some data types that are out of the box that are known and are identified and will work, but the majority you're going to find you will have to refine those models using various techniques, regex or trainable classifiers. And through that process, you're going to be developing a team that has the ability to look at an issue being raised, refine it, and work through the workflows of data remediation and getting to the point where you reduced your inherent risk and you're in a steady state in an operation. So in order to do this, it's important that you understand, is it CCPA, is it SOX, is it PCI, what are you worried about? Is it HIPAA? And putting that forward and into a business plan that says we're going to invest X, and that when we invest X, we get Y in risk reduction and improvement of our security position. So the strategy part is important because the ask, otherwise it's hard to get the type of funding you're going to need for these types of programs without having at least a business plan with a strategy. Thanks, Raul.
Thanks, Marvin. And kind of to, dovetailing into what Marvin mentioned, right, is when you go into, once you develop the strategy and you start engaging, that's where a lot of the planning begins, right? Kick off with the questionnaire, you engage different business groups, understanding, data repositories that you manage on premise, understanding whether or not you do have a data classification scheme developed. If not, then work with the business to develop one. Defining a data and labeling model, understanding the risk classifications within your organization, where they start and where they end. Once you've gone through and understand and develop these KPIs that are important to the business, then we move on to discovery of data, right? Just scanning all the data as it relates to the organization, different business groups, reporting on the different risks that's involved based on what you found, and then ensuring that you're not only do you create this inventory, but you're also at this moment also doing some refinement, right? Making sure that, especially if it's important to a business, like for example, social security number, which is a pretty common ask. There are times where organizations define or use or store that data in different methods that either the solution will not pick up, or the solution starts to look at other documents that may contain similar patterns, and then you just get a bunch of false positives. After that, you start figuring out, okay, because this organization stores this data in this way, we need to refine that detection method. Once you go through, do some initial refinement based on the scanning, then you start moving into the remediation effort, which we talked about earlier, right? Which is reviewing and executing of those plans, scaling that, leveraging an ITSM solution, prioritizing the remediation efforts based on risk and classification. Anything else you want to add, Marvin?
No, just I think what is helpful is if you own, say, O365 E3 or E5, whatever it is, that you get your on-premises scanners up and running, and just do a rough scan to get an idea of your inherent risk when you get to sort of that first part of discovery, and then that can really help build your business plan to say, look, we've got X billions of dollars in risk, and that's just in this department. And so it's clear this is something we need to take on as a program, and it allows you to bring substantial qualitative information to the story, not we just need to do this because of privacy and competing with various priorities. So if we progress to the next slide, which I think was just talking about the next webinars, And let's do our Q&A now. There's a couple questions that are lined up, and so if we want to read through them and then get any qualification that we might need, that would be good. Okay, so Raul, do you see the 3 questions we have so far?
I do.
The first, yeah, okay.
Yeah, so I can address that question there. So can MS tools scan other clouds outside of MS, say in AWS? That's a great question. You know, I know we were talking about unstructured data. We covered a lot of the solutions that do scan unstructured data. One of the solutions that wasn't covered here simply because it's primarily, I guess, introduced as a structured data scanning solution is Microsoft Azure Purview. And Azure Purview does have the capability to scan AWS storage. So that is something that is a capability that you can use with any Microsoft solution set. You can scan, you can label based on that as well, or just do a discovery scan.
And question number 2 is, what method are you using to detect and classify data on-premise storage, such as file shares, versus OneDrive, O365, etc.?
So, maybe I see that as 2 different questions, right? So, when you ask about what type of method is it, you know, is there a way to scan NFS versus CIF shares? The answer is it scans both from an on-premise perspective. There's an AIP on-prem scanner that you can deploy to scan those systems now. The beauty of all this work, right, is I mentioned earlier there's a security and compliance portal. In that portal, there's a method to create what's called a sensitive information type, and that's the detection method that Microsoft leverages to go and detect and look for these sensitive information types. Now, when you define a sensitive information type, there are different ways to detect that sensitive information type. One of which is just your standard keywords that you can define. Another is dictionaries, and you know, the third is, you know, what's very commonly used out there in the space, which is regular expressions, which is just pattern matching based on a specific syntax that you're looking for. Another is exact data matching, which is another common tactic that's used out there by DLP solutions, such as anyway, so where you can populate a table and then it looks exactly for that specific data. So like user, social security number, and maybe employee ID. So every time it knows to find and look for that, it's going to classify it as X or just detect it as a sensitive information type. And then lastly, trainable classifiers that uses statistical pattern matching based on the document that it reads. So they can say if it, for example, if an I-9 form always looks like this, we can for sure identify it as an I-9 form and we'll classify it as X. Hopefully that answers the question.
Question 3, I'm going to try to frame up a bit. It says, does Agile work with data that is input from other vendors? What requirements would be required if the data was imported monthly? So, so context is that these systems are installed at your enterprise, and the data from other vendors. So I think, you know, what we're looking at is you would I assume this is like in a data file that's being imported because you're part of a value chain. So for instance, as far as CCPA is concerned today, the data you generate is what you're responsible for, but the data you export to downstream vendors you're responsible for as well, as far as the liability purposes. So the context, I guess, would be is if you're getting data coming in the form of an Excel or a flat file or whatever that data format may be that you would scan and want to classify that and make sure that you're protecting it within the downstream vendor. I guess if we didn't quite get the nature of that question right, maybe you could put a qualifier in there. So Raul, would you answer that any differently or?
No, I agree.
Mm-hmm. And Alec, any other questions that we have in Q&A? Oh, that's a good question for you. So I think, are we posting it at our website? It would seem like a good idea, perhaps.
All of our webinars will be on posted on agile.com/webinars, and everyone who's attended this presentation will receive a link to the replay as well.
Okay, perfect. And if anybody would like us, as we have a little extra time here, we're happy to go back to the slide and provide qualification or additional information about it. If there's something we move through it pretty quick. Obviously, you're welcome to reach out to any of your Agile contacts and set up a meeting. We're happy to talk about what's here. I have to say that we've been in this space for a very long time. I think we've finally seen the accumulation of what is sort of the technology being available. So this idea of the multi-tenanted cloud and the ability to have outside people be able to authenticate and read documents that are protected. That's sort of one of the enablers. The other point is the maturity of the technology for both on-premise and cloud. And then lastly, some very large privacy sort of regulations that have come along in the GDPR and CCPA and a lot of other people that there are state regulations that are coming. So I think this has sort of driven it to the point now where we have to do something about it, and the technology is available. So it's always nice to be in a space that we've been monitoring, I think, for the last 15 years, which was, rights management and semantic DLP and all of these systems. And now we've arrived at something that is a very workable solution. We have a couple more questions. Alec, if you would like to just go live mic and read those out to us, we'll take them.
Sure. What M365 license types and levels do you recommend for data discovery?
Yeah, I can take that one if you don't mind, Marvin. So if we start at the biggest blanket SKU, M365 E3 provides the capability to perform data discovery, right? So you can deploy an AIP scanner and do a discovery leveraging your on-prem shares. You can perform discovery leveraging O365 solution set. If we break that down to EMS E3, that's going to have the a la carte SKU, which is AIP P1. So that's the licensing you need to focus on. If you're just simply worried about discovery as you move into data remediation, so auto applying labels, for example, or auto recommendations, which is a nice friendly UI pop-up feature for users to say, hey, based on our scan, we see that you have some sensitive data in place. We would recommend label X. Then you need to move up to the next label SKU, which is E5, M365 E5, MS E5, AIP P2 is what's lumped into that as well. And I believe there is a new security and compliance SKU that would contain that as well. And for that specific SKU, I would recommend you talk to your account exec for Microsoft to get the finer details in terms of licensing as it pertains to that SKU.
The point I wanted to bring up is as we're, we have a large ServiceNow practice. What we've done, and obviously integrate with other ITSM systems, is as you scan and you alert on a large file, we've created an integration between the log files whereby a ticket gets opened and then notifies, the file owner or the data steward of the nature of the file and the need for remediation. So this integration work allows really for the seamless operation of it and allows you to sort of monitor and look at your risk. Alec, do you want to give us the next question?
Looks like that was it.
Okay. Well, that's good. So any other last questions, clarifications through slides, or anything that anybody would like to? I'd like to thank everybody for your attendance today and exciting topic. We'd love to talk with you more about it. And thank you, everybody. Be safe and have a very prosperous 2021, and as we all get back up on our feet and go. So take care and have a good year. Raul, any closing statements?
Yeah, really quick, if you guys could join us for our webinar on February 25th, as mentioned here, to learn how to leverage SailPoint's identity governance capabilities with Microsoft Azure Active Directory's unique access management and identity protection services to better provide governance-based access to all of on-premise and cloud applications. That's going to be a good webinar to jump in on. So with that, have a great rest of your day, everyone.
Thank you. Take care.
Bye.
Bye.